So today we're going to talk about African Americans in theater. I can't even begin to touch on all of the great contributions that African Americans have made to American theater, but I just wanted to give you a brief history of the modern era of African Americans in theater. One thing that you have to take into account is that from 1910 to 1930, African American populations migrated in large numbers from the South to the North, with prominent figures like W.E.B. Du Bois leading what became known as the Great Migration. In 1915 and 1916, natural disasters in the South put black workers and what were called sharecroppers, who were pretty much a holdover from old slavery. Oftentimes, these were African Americans who only know how to work fields, and so they would work the crops and give a share of their profits to the people that owned the land. Hence the name sharecroppers. Well, these workers and sharecroppers became out of work because of this natural disaster. And additionally, during and after World War I, migration really started to amp up because immigration to the United States fell, and northern recruiters headed south to entice black workers to their companies. By 1920, some 300,000 African Americans from the South had moved north, and Harlem was one of the most popular destinations for these families. The Harlem Renaissance was the development of African American neighborhoods in New York City as a black cultural mecca in the early 20th century and subsequent social and artistic explosion that resulted. So keep in mind, we often hear about the Italian Renaissance. Well, there was a Renaissance here in the United States, and this was called the Harlem Renaissance because there was so much artistic explosion in Harlem during this time period, and it was often caused by the influx of African Americans from the South to the North because of the Great Migration, and they came up with all kinds of great ideas in terms of all types of arts, including visual, performing, literary, and musical. Lastly, roughly from the 1910s through the mid-1930s, the period is considered the golden age in African American culture, manifesting in literature, music, stage performance, and art. So from that time came the Federal Theater Project. And these are actually some of the great African Americans that were involved in the Harlem Renaissance. And like I said, this included actors, actresses, playwrights, poets, musicians, novelists, and up-and-coming thinkers, really. A lot of essayists as well. So the Federal Theater Project was a government-run theater of the 1930s. And you might remember, or you will remember, this term being used as we talked about playwriting, and how the Federal Theater Project was something that developed a lot of theater during this time period in the 1930s. During the Great Depression, that was federally run, and it included mainly, and it started out as white theater, including both performers and directors, and all of the theater artists were white, but they developed it was designed to create jobs for out-of-work theater artists. Among its most important contributions to theater was the creation of an African American theater company, and many African American theater companies actually. One of these companies, the Negro People's Theater, was housed in Harlem in the Lafayette Theater. It was there in 1935 through 1936 that John Houseman staged an extremely successful all-black version of Macbeth with the help of actor-director Orson Welles. At the beginning of the second half of this century, African American playwrights were beginning to be recognized for their powerful and well-written plays which addressed the needs and issues of Black Americans. One of the most important of these early Black playwrights was Lorraine Hansberry, who was born out of the Harlem Renaissance and later was around during the Black Arts Movement, which we'll discuss soon. Lorraine Hansberry wrote A Raisin in the Sun in 1959, and it was a warm, moving play that deals with the dreams and setbacks of an African American family in Chicago after the Great Migration. Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun examines a proud African American family and the relationships between its members as they deal with issues such as racism and integration. This award-winning play was the first play to be presented on Broadway by not only an African American, but an African American woman at that. Other important early Black playwrights are Ed Bullins, Douglas Turner Ward, and Ossie Davis. The 1960s was a time of major changes in American culture. The Black Arts or Black Aesthetic movement was the name given to a group of politically motivated Black poets, artists, dramatists, musicians, and writers who emerged in the wake of the Black Power movement. The poet and playwright Leroy Jones, who later became known as Amiri Baraka, is widely considered to be the father of the Black Arts movement, which began in 1965 and ended in 1975. An important cultural change was the appearance of new African American theater companies. One of the most important of these was the Black Arts Repertoire Theater. Founded in 1964 by then Leroy Jones, who again later became known as Amiri Baraka. This company produced plays with financial support from the Federal Office of Economic Opportunity. By the end of its funding, by the time its funding ended in 1968, there were many other African American companies producing plays all around the nation. Although these are more numerous than before, they represented a small percentage of the total number of theater companies in the United States at the time. Other important early groups include Black Arts West in San Francisco, Concept East in Detroit, and the New Lafayette Theater in New York. Perhaps the most influential of the African American companies that has been the Negro Ensemble Company of New York, which was established in 1968 with federal support from the Ford Foundation. This theater not only employed a permanent company of actors, but also developed a training program for Black actors, playwrights, and directors. It is still in existence to this day. In more recent years, African American dramatists have continued to make major contributions to American theater. One of these playwrights is August Wilson. August Wilson was born in 1965. His works include a series of 10 plays, the Pittsburgh Cycle, for which he received 2 Pulitzer Prizes for drama. Each work in the series is set in a different decade and depicts comic and tragic aspects of the African American experience. Wilson's first major success, produced in 1984, was Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. This play tells the story of vastly talented Black musicians who are forced to work for abusive whites during the 1920s in Chicago during the Great Migration, or after the Great Migration, I should say. Once these African Americans had come to Chicago, and then they were forced to work for these abusive whites. Another of August Wilson's plays that you might have heard of is Fences. It was produced in 1985 and it was awarded a Pulitzer Prize. Fences was produced in 2016 as a film starring, produced, and directed by Denzel Washington. August Wilson died in 2005. Wilson's plays tend to explore African American characters who are searching for identity, dignity, and fulfillment, issues still valid today.